the edge of chaos. Complex systems are perched on the edge of chaos, a curious state between order and disorder, between the status quo and radical innovation, between stability and transformation. Note that complex systems have a combination of order and randomness. They always operate within boundaries, within a structure of order. You can't have self-organization without also having boundaries. When a complex system moves over the edge of chaos, then it crosses a boundary and becomes something different. John Horgan has claimed that everything interesting happens at the edge of chaos. Biologists use the edge effect to describe the tendency for a greater variety and density of organisms to cluster in the boundaries between communities. In complexity theory, the edge of chaos describes complex systems because they possess both elements of order and elements of fluidity. A crystal is not a complex system because it possesses perfect internal order and there is nothing left to change. At the other extreme, a boiling liquid is a chaotic rather than a complex system. There is very little order. By way of contrast, a complex system such as amoebae, the stock exchange, or an economy has both order and enough fluidity to change. In the words of biologist E. O. Wilson, the system that will evolve most rapidly must fall between, and more precisely on, the edge of chaos, possessing order, but with the parts connected loosely enough to be easily altered. Zipf's rank-size rule. The brilliant economist Paul Krugman has shown that cities behave in many different ways, like complex, self-organizing adaptive systems. Many of his arguments are highly technical, but one that is easily understood concerns the size of American cities. It turns out that they obey Zipf's rank-size rule from Harvard professor of philosophy George Zipf, which says that the population of a city in any country is inversely proportional to its ranking. If the rule works precisely, then the second largest city would have half the population of the largest, and the third largest would have 1/3 the people of the top city, and so on. Clearly, we should not expect a perfect fit. This never happens with data and laws. And you might protest that Los Angeles has well over half the population of New York. But as you go down the rankings, the fit becomes amazing. City number 10 in the U.S. is Houston, with 3.85 million people. City number 100 is Spokane in Washington State. This has 370,000 people, fractionally under 1/10 the size of Houston. Krugman tells us, if you regress the log of rank on the log of population, you get a coefficient of negative 1.003 with a standard error of only 0.01, a slope close to 1 and very tightly fitted. We are unused to seeing regularities this exact in economics. It is so exact that I find it spooky. Even more eerie is that this power law has worked well for at least a century. The same shape of line emerges if we analyze relative city sizes in 1940 or 1890. Simon's theory of clumps and lumps. Why do cities organize themselves like this? We don't know. But one idea that Herbert Simon came up with nearly a half-century ago, which may well be right, is that whatever size cities start out, they will then attract to themselves a similar proportion of any subsequent increase in population. This is the theory of clumps and lumps. Each existing city is a clump of whatever size. When population increases, it does so in lumps, not just through the excess of new births over deaths, but through lumps of new arrivals, by immigration in the case of the U.S., and many other countries by people drifting in from the countryside. But each new lump will tend to attract itself to a clump in proportion to the existing size of the lump. Simon explains this by the availability of employment and by the observed fact that most entrepreneurs who provide the employment stay near where they started. Gutenberg-Richter Law. Whether or not you believe the clumps and lumps theory with regard to cities, the weird thing is that Zipf's power law does work, not just for cities, but for things you might think totally dissimilar. It works in the same way for earthquakes, meteorites, and species. Zipf's law applied to earthquakes gives us the Gutenberg-Richter law, which says that the frequency of earthquakes is inversely proportional to their size. Similarly, the frequency with which a meteorite hits Earth is, happily, inversely proportional to its size. Or if we plot the number of animal species that exceed a particular size, we uncover the same relationship. Cities, the economy, earthquakes, meteorites, and quite likely evolution too, are self-organizing systems that behave in clear and similar patterns, and that produce order from instability. The whole mysteriously assembles. We are back to Adam Smith's hidden hand, although this paw stretches around far more than the economy. The constituent parts surely cannot know what they are doing. Or can they? In biology, how do we explain how cells arrive in their allotted places? Krugman comments, "An individual fruit fly cell does not think to itself, 'I am part of a wing.' Yet, cells collectively seem to affect to decide to become different parts of the organism. Experiments suggest that cells indeed behave as if they knew their own polar coordinates." In the business world, think of how teams sometimes magically gel together and define, without the need for words, each individual's role. Or, more darkly, how easily a crowd can turn into a frenzied mob, acting in perfect accord to destroy something hated. The whole is more fundamental and purposeful than the parts. Self-organization and the emergence and adaptation of complex systems are deeply rooted in the universe, and we had better notice, respect, and take account of them. Parkinson's laws. One man who did take note of organization's self-organizing characteristics, although the concept of self-organization had not yet been invented, was C. Northcote Parkinson, 1909 to 1993. In 1958, he published Parkinson's Law, a commentary on organizations that was both serious and satirical. The eponymous law was that work expands to fill the time available. Parkinson's thesis was that bosses increase the size of their departments because there is more work to do and because they like to have large empires, not because they need to in rational economic terms. An official wants to multiply subordinates, not rivals, he comments, noting also that officials make work for each other. The fact that there is work to do justifies and masks the real objective, which has nothing to do with economic logic. The law works in the professions also. As has been remarked, town with one lawyer, poor lawyer. Town with two lawyers, rich lawyers. Parkinson himself was an official in the British Navy during the Second World War. He pointed out in his book that whereas the number of officers and men in the Navy itself fell by 31% between 1914 and 1928, and the number of ships fell even more sharply, by 61%, the Admiralty administrators yet contrived to increase their ranks by 78%. In complexity terms, the Navy administration was self-organizing, fulfilling objectives that were quite independent of the original intention. Parkinson later followed up with a second law, applying both to individuals and to corporations. It was, expenditure rises to meet incomes. This idea is closely related to a more academically respectable concept invented about the same time that is also an illustration of organizations' self-organizing tendencies. That is, organizational slack. Sayert and March's theory of organizational slack. Organizational slack was invented by two academics from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Richard Sayert and James March, in their 1963 book titled A Behavioral Theory of the Firm. The theory states that firms are not profit-maximizing, but rather coalitions of interests, and that firms deliberately build up excess resources during times of success so that they have fat that they can shed to survive in hard times. The fat is the organizational slack. Sayert and March applied no normative judgment to organizational slack. As the title of their book suggests, they saw it in behavioral terms and were explaining what happens and why. They would have been very happy with the concept of self-organization. As business people, however, while observing the tendencies that Sayert and March describe, we may not be so tolerant and disinterested. Fat begets fat. Once one department or division is allowed to be overstaffed, others follow fast. Fat obstructs flexibility and speed of response. Fat makes it even more difficult than it always is to be customer-centered. So the existence of organizational slack makes it more likely that bad times will come. And the other way around. Cutting slack and putting it to work for customers makes it more likely that competitors will never be able to catch up, decreasing the chances of severe profit pressure. The opposite of organizational slack is discretionary investment that builds future profits by improving what is offered to customers. It is sometimes difficult to differentiate between these two opposites. Is a large R&D department an investment for the future, or organizational slack? It's probably both. Top management will always say that it is an investment. Yet, if that is so, why is the first response when profits fall usually to cut such investments as though they were just organizational slack? The only way to be sure that something is an investment and not slack is to outsource it, so that there is no internal vested interest to fall foul of Parkinson's first two laws and Sayert and March's organizational slack. Complexity and business. Complexity theory is about complicated feedback systems, about how groups or whole entities emerge from quite different parts, about how complex systems poise themselves on the edge of chaos, and about how they organize themselves spontaneously and deliberately into large-scale patterns. So what? Be aware that small changes can transform the whole competitive system. Both quantum and complexity theories tell us that reality is in some ways indivisible. In David Bohm's words, an undivided wholeness. The character of the whole arises through the relationships between parts, and when the parts change, then the whole may radically alter its character. If some specialty stores are opened in a shopping mall, this may modestly boost the business of existing stores by bringing in new customers. But if another mall opens up 15 miles down the road, the stores may suddenly become unprofitable. Business is intrinsically exposed to such sudden swings from apparently minor influences. How useful is this knowledge? I'm not sure. Of course, we should try to keep an eye open for challenges from unsuspected quarters, but few of us are blessed with panoramic vision. The main lesson may be that when things go wrong, we shouldn't assume that we know why. One common mistake is to assume that something in the market has changed. Another mistake is to invent a large cause when a small one will do. Suppose the sales of filofaxes slump. Why? One explanation is that yuppies are poorer than they used to be, or are dying out, and are therefore not buying filofaxes. If true, this is a major market change, and there's not much that Filofax can do about it. But what if something much less momentous is happening, like the entry of a new competitor selling cheaper personal organizers? This is a smaller change, and something can be done about it. Yet in 1990, Filofax almost went bust because it believed that its problem was a major market shift rather than a minor change in competition. At the level of the global economy, small events can also have weird and unpredictable consequences. It is not likely, for example, that the Russian economic crisis of late 1998 and early 1999, which nearly derailed the world economy, would have happened if President Clinton had not been totally preoccupied with the little local matter of his possible impeachment. Complex systems are inherently unpredictable. The global economy is probably the most complex system on Earth, possibly in the whole universe. We should not be surprised that the global economy is so unpredictable or subject to unintended consequences. Yet, there are still detectable patterns well known to stockholders and others. Like they say, when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches pneumonia. Look for and practice emergence. Complex systems come together from the bottom up. They emerge. They evolve. They cohere. They come together from many constituent parts. They seem to have no problem doing this. Structure comes from no structure or from lesser structures. The universe manages, somehow, to bring forth ever more complex structures from simple causes. Bacteria, plants, animals, stars, galaxies. The most important thing in the world, like the mind, consciousness, markets, economies, and society, are emergent phenomena. They are not planned. They happen. Once again, we see the invisible hand working overtime. Recently, the more intelligent writers on business strategy have realized that it, too, should emerge rather than be planned or dictated. Ask yourself, how did the most successful corporations from, say, 1750 to 1960 arrive at their successful strategies before we knew how to plan them? Or ask another question. Who knows better what a firm should do? Its bosses or the market? The leaders or the troops? If we reflect on emergence, we realize that experiments of great strategic value often occur as we go along in the normal course of business. We open a small restaurant, and it is amazingly successful. A dull and low-status business unit invents a minor new product that suddenly is all the rage. We botch the technology and stumble over the Post-it note. Things come together. Success emerges, but the best-laid plans of mice and men. The lesson is not to do nothing and hope for the best. The lesson is to spot emergence and then give it one almighty push on its way. It is better to observe the market than to plan it. It is better to see what is emerging from the lower reaches of the firm than to dictate from on high. Think carefully about the role of self-organization in your organization. Almost the only class of complex system in the universe that is not purely self-organizing is the modern business corporation and other hierarchical organizations modeled on it. A laser organizes itself. Photons, that is, light particles, spontaneously organize themselves into a beam. A hurricane organizes itself. A living cell manages to self-organize. Cities organize themselves. So do economies, when left alone. The Soviet Union is said to have had 8 million managers in its economic planning bureaucracy, which proved to be 8 million too many. Why do so many business people preach laissez-faire for the economy but never for the structure of the firms within it? I'm not advocating that you automatically leave your organizations to organize themselves. The cost of self-adjustment could be much higher than that of intervention. There are powerful selfish and socialistic tendencies built into human behavior and into large organizations. Just because organizations can organize themselves does not mean that they will organize themselves the way you want them to, or that you have no right to intervene. Resources will probably be wasted by self-organization. But you should recognize the tendency towards self-organization. Sometimes this should make you stand aside and allow a team to work out how to do what you have all agreed to do. Sometimes it should make you extremely vigilant, aware that a system that is not controlled or watched will develop its own agenda. Sometimes it should make you avoid complex adaptive systems altogether. If you go with a simpler system, it is more likely to do what you want. If you double the size or increase the complexity of your organization, don't be surprised if it does unwelcome new things. That's self-organization. View your firm as a living organism, as a complex, adaptive system. If it has a life of its own, the organization is more than the sum of its parts. It is more than a set of economic transactions. It is more than the people who work in it. It is even more than the set of relationships that it builds. The organization is its own thing. It belongs to its own species. It can breed, and it can die. It is a highly ambiguous entity. It can be bought and sold, just as if it were property, a pet or a slave. Yet, each time it is bought, it becomes something new. Subtly, or not so subtly different, yet always recognizably similar to its previous incarnation. It's all a great mystery, difficult to understand and difficult to describe. It shouldn't be so hard. As Peter Senge says, is it that we think life starts and ends with us, humans? Surely simpler organisms are alive. Why then can't we regard more complex organisms, like families or societies or companies, as being alive as well? Is the tide pool, a teeming community of life, any less alive than the anemones, mussels, or hermit crabs that populate it? What difference does it make if we view the firm as an organism rather than a machine? Here are 8 benefits. 1. It takes away the illusion of control. A living thing, even a pet or a slave, is more difficult to control than a machine. An organism is unpredictable and headstrong. It has a mind of its own. 2. It stresses the role of growth and innovation. Machines don't grow. Organisms can't do anything else, or they die. 3. It reminds us that organizations, or parts of them, can be self-starting. A machine needs to be started, switched on and switched off. Machines suffer from entropy. They run down unless they are regularly maintained. Organisms can start themselves and renew themselves. They grow new cells and regulate their own metabolisms. We could debate, in the case of any particular organization, whether it is more like an entropy-bound machine or a self-renewing organism. Clearly, there is a continuum between these two extremes. 4. Organisms are part of systems. An organism is a complex whole composed of many subsystems and part of many supersystems above it. The corporation is going to be affected by a change in its subsystems. For example, by the recruitment or retirement of individuals, and by supersystems, its markets and competitive environment. Machines are not affected like this. 5. Organisms can build networks and relationships. Machines can't. Humans and a few other organisms can. Admittedly, the parallel is not perfect. It is not so much the organization as such building the networks and relationships, but rather the humans inside the organization building those relationships. There is a danger, therefore, of slipping into anthropomorphic talk about organizations, of regarding them as people. It may be better to regard an organization as a person rather than as a machine, but it is definitely not correct to think that the organization basically comprises its people and is an extension of them. Here we need a good dose of quantum indeterminacy. The people are not owned by the organization or compelled to remain part of it. Even when they are in it, the people have a life outside it. The networks and relationships that are built are not just with other humans, but with other organizations and with society as a whole. 6. Organisms have their own purpose. Machines have the purpose prescribed by their builders or owners. Organizations have purposes that evolve as a result of their founders' characteristics and what happens along the way. Does Microsoft have a purpose aside from making money for its owners? Or the Disney Corporation? Or McDonald's? Of course they do. You couldn't imagine any of these organizations swapping purposes, even if the owners told them so. 7. Organizations learn. Only living things can learn. Clearly, organizations can learn. Greenpeace can learn. A rock band can learn. A baseball team can learn. Microsoft can learn. About the importance of the Internet, for example, even when the company's founders were skeptical. Even the U.S. Republican and Democratic political parties can learn. It is worth asking, however, whether organizations can know more than their individual members know in total. Knowledge may exist as a function of working together, but knowledge can surely only reside within the human players, not in the organization independent of its members. As Peter Senge notes, it is not just organizations that learn, but also the global business community. Here is yet another society or organism. Technologies and ways of doing business get copied and extended. Self-service, the multi-divisional corporation, the multinational corporation, hostile takeovers, leveraged buyouts and buy-ins, and spin-offs are invented in America and exported to most other economies. Total quality management is elaborated in Japan and then re-imported into the United States, and within a few years, it's ubiquitous. As we saw in Chapter 1, organisms mutate and species learn, and improvements are diffused rapidly because there are only those that learn and those that die. In this respect, machines have an easier time. And finally, 8. Organisms can have their own character and uniqueness. It is possible for a machine to be unique, but it's highly unusual. A machine that has its own characteristics rather than those intended by its designers is probably not a very good machine. On the other hand, organisms are unique, and sophisticated organisms do exhibit their own character. Humans, and possibly other organisms, have emotions. Organizations have their own cultures that are the product of history and accident, as well as human design. A firm is sui generis, of its own species. One important characteristic of the species is that each member of it develops its own unique way of doing things, and emotion is an important part of this. Use the power of landscapes. One of the most useful concepts to emerge from complexity science is the metaphor of landscapes. Michael Lissack and Johann Roos point out that we are hardwired to recognize patterns in space. They provide a thrilling account of developments in the PC business in terms of landscapes. They write, "As technology shifted, the hill which was best to climb shifted as well. If you picture time as a landscape of clay made by a child, then the history of major events in the PC world is similar to what would happen if an angry adult came along, picked up the model and gave it a good, hard twist. Up pops a hill where one wasn't before, and the old hills seem to fold in on themselves. IBM once owned 25% of Intel, all of Windows, and had the opportunity to buy both Microsoft and Apple. Picture a set of mountains, each a distinct subset of the competitive world. IBM on one, Xerox on another, AT&T on a third. They are connected only by difficult mountain passes, and the only transport is donkeys. Suddenly, two changes occur. The Swiss tunnel through the mountains, and the automobile is invented. Just yesterday, trekking from IBM land to Xerox land was the journey of a lifetime. Now it is summed up by a button on your desk and can be ended in an instant. Where is the landscape now? The graphical interface introduced by Apple, that little outpost, would now seize the hill. IBM wanted a graphical interface for itself. In the process, it created Bill Gates. Now the landscapes were merging as well as shifting. IBM's mountain was being eroded from underneath. There was a volcanic eruption. Intel and Microsoft, two lowly suppliers, were transforming the landscape. With Windows 3.0, Mount St. Helens erupted. IBM's hilltop was no more. The hill itself was still there, but it was lower by a few thousand feet and had a large crater in its midst. Create your own landscape metaphors to describe what is happening and what might happen in your own terrain.